Would you believe a 4-year-old who told you he was trying to save a baby? Or would you assume the worst? Abandoned roadside, a day of unexpected struggles. The sun beat down mercilessly on the empty road, the kind of heat that made the asphalt sizzle, distorting the horizon. Little Malek, just 4 years old, walked barefoot, his tiny hands gripping the handle of a stroller, his small frame barely able to manage the weight, yet he kept going. His feet hurt, the soles of his bare feet red from the rough pavement. His throat was dry, a parched feeling creeping in with every step. He didn't care. The baby inside the stroller cried incessantly, her little body wriggling, her face scrunched in distress. She was an infant, maybe 8 months old, too young to be alone, too small to be abandoned on the sidewalk. Malik wasn't sure why the baby had been left there. He didn't know how she got there, or why. All he knew was that he couldn't just leave her, so he took her. He carefully pushed the stroller through the hot, empty street, trying to find help, but it seemed like no one cared. People in cars passed by without a second glance, lost in their own lives. The road stretched on forever, heat waves rising from the ground. The stroller wobbled as Malik pushed it forward, determined but exhausted. He had to find someone. He had to make sure the baby was safe. Then suddenly, a siren. Tires screeching. The sound of a police car approaching fast. Malik froze. His heart raced. Was he in trouble now? He didn't know what to expect. He didn't know if the officer would understand. The police car pulled up in front of him, its tires screeching to a halt. The officer's face appeared through the rolled-down window, a middle-aged man, eyes squinting against the sun. "What's going on here, kid?" the officer barked, his tone stern and accusatory. Malik didn't answer right away. He looked up at the officer, unsure. He just wanted help. He wanted someone to take the baby and make sure she was okay. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say. The officer leaned out of the car, squinting at the baby in the stroller. "Whose baby is this? Why are you pushing her around like this?" Malik's heart thudded louder, but he felt his stomach churn. He wasn't sure what was happening, but it didn't feel right. Why was the officer asking all these questions? He wasn't the one who left the baby there. He didn't know who had. The officer's eyes narrowed, and Malik could feel the weight of suspicion building. "Where are your parents, kid?" "Where'd you get this baby?" The words stung. No one ever asked about his parents. No one cared about him. But the baby? Why was the officer focused on the baby? Malik didn't know how to answer. His parents weren't here. He didn't have anyone to answer for him. The officer moved forward, stepping out of the car. "Step aside. Let me take a look at the baby." Malik felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Was this his fault? He didn't understand why the officer seemed so angry. Didn't the man see the baby's face? Didn't he know she needed help too? Malik clutched the stroller a little tighter. As the officer moved closer, Malik took a step back. His little legs trembled from the exhaustion. His grip tightened on the stroller. The officer raised an eyebrow. "You think I'm gonna let you just walk away with this kid?" Malik looked up at him, his voice small but desperate. "She needs help," he said, his words quivering. "She's alone. She was left outside." The officer stared at him, then at the baby, his face softening for a brief moment before hardening again. "Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Drop a comment below." He tried to speak, but his words caught in his throat. He wanted to scream that he hadn't done anything wrong, that he was just trying to help. But the officer was already walking away, dialing in his call, not paying any attention to Malik's panic-stricken face. Malik stood there, frozen in place, confusion and fear swirling inside him. Why was this happening? Why was he being treated like this? The officer's voice crackled through the radio again. "Send backup. Possible kidnapping situation. We got a young black male with a white baby. He claims he found her, but we'll need to investigate." The words cut through Malik like a knife. Young black male with a white baby. It was as though the officer had already made up his mind about Malik. His race, his age, and his clothes were enough to make the officer assume the worst. Malik's hands clenched the stroller handle, his knuckles turning white. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a threat. He just wanted to save the baby. But to the officer, it didn't matter. He was just another problem. Another kid the world had already written off. Malik's eyes welled up with tears, but he didn't let them fall. He had learned a long time ago that tears wouldn't help. He wasn't going to let the officer see how scared he was. He couldn't. The officer turned his back and walked back toward his patrol car, his eyes never leaving Malik, as if he were expecting him to run, expecting him to be guilty. But Malik wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't going to leave the baby alone. "Please," Malik whispered to himself, trying to steady his breathing. "I didn't do anything wrong." But his words seemed to fade into the air, lost in the chaos of the situation. The officer returned to his car, his hand still on the radio. Malik stood there, helpless, watching, as the officer made the call that would change everything. "Backup's on the way," Officer Daniels muttered again, glancing over his shoulder. "We'll see if this kid's story checks out." Malik swallowed hard, tears threatening to spill from his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He couldn't afford to cry, not now. He had to stay strong, for the baby who needed help and didn't deserve this either. Have you ever been wrongly accused? How did it feel? Tell us in the comments. Malik's heart raced as the officer's grip tightened on his arm. His tiny frame trembled under the weight of the situation. He didn't know what to do, how to explain. The baby's cries grew louder in his ears, but the officer wasn't listening. Malik was scared, confused, and now he felt like his entire world was closing in on him. "I didn't steal her, I promise." Malik's voice cracked, desperate to make the officer understand. But Officer Daniels didn't seem to care. "Where's your mother?" the officer demanded, his voice booming in the oppressive silence. "Where are your parents?" Malik's throat tightened. His mother. She was never around. She had never been around. He had learned to fend for himself, to survive in a world that had long since forgotten about him. His hands clenched, his fingers digging into the stroller's handle, his only connection to the child he was trying to protect. I don't have anyone," Malik stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer's face twisted in frustration, his hand tightening around Malik's arm as he yanked him forward. "Then where did you find this baby, huh? What's your story, kid?" Malik's mind raced. He couldn't explain everything to the officer. He couldn't tell him how he found the baby outside a store, left alone and abandoned. No one cared enough to stop and help, so Malik had done what he could. He had just wanted to help. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was that the officer was angry, and Malik was in trouble. He was a boy on his own, in the wrong place, with no one to back him up. Who would believe him? Who would care enough to listen? "I didn't do anything wrong," Malik whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of his words. But Officer Daniels wasn't hearing it. He didn't even look down at Malik with the slightest hint of empathy. "You're coming with me." "We'll sort this out at the station," the officer said, his tone final. His words were like a sentence handed down before a trial even took place. Tears welled up in Malik's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He had been through too much. He had learned how to survive, how to push through the pain of rejection and judgment. He had never expected anyone to care, to believe in him. But today, he had done the right thing. He had saved the baby. He had tried to protect her from whatever danger was out there. And now, it was all falling apart. "Please." Malik's voice shook, barely audible. "I didn't steal her. I just found her. Please, I don't want to go with you." The officer ignored him, his steps heavy, as he dragged Malik toward the patrol car. The crowd of people that had gathered watched in silence, some with pity, others with indifference. No one stepped forward to help. No one spoke out. They all watched as Malik, the boy they had written off, was taken away. His heart pounded in his chest. The baby's cries still echoed in his ears, and Malik couldn't help but feel like everything he had done to protect her was unraveling before his eyes. And then there was the baby. She was still crying, her tiny fists waving in the air as Malik was pulled away. Malik's heart broke for her. She was all alone, just like him. The officer didn't seem to care about her distress. Malik was just another problem for the world to dismiss. "Please," Malik whispered, looking back at the stroller. "Please don't leave her alone." But the officer didn't answer. He didn't even glance back as he shoved Malik into the back of the car. Malik's chest tightened, his stomach twisted with fear and frustration. Why wouldn't anyone believe him? Why wouldn't anyone stop to listen? Malik had done everything right, everything he could to help. He had found the baby, tried to protect her, tried to keep her safe. And yet, all the officer saw was a young black boy with no family and no one to back him up. It didn't matter that he had been the one to step in when no one else would. It didn't matter that he had been the one to try and save a life. In that moment, Malik realized that it wasn't just the officer who didn't believe him. It was the whole world. The world had already decided who he was, who he would be. And it wasn't someone who could make a difference. As the patrol car drove away, Malik sat silently in the back, his heart heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling of injustice, the weight of being misunderstood and unseen. Would you have stopped to help, or would fear have made you walk away? Let us know. Malik's heart was pounding, his palms clammy with sweat. He had just been dragged away by Officer Daniels, his hands shaking as he was hauled toward the patrol car. Everything felt surreal. The baby's cries, the officer's harsh grip on his arm, the fear creeping up his spine. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? He had tried to protect the baby. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. The car door was already open, the officer getting ready to shove him inside. Malik's chest tightened, and he thought about how many times he had been thrown away by the world, just like the baby. He hadn't expected help. He had never been expected to do the right thing, but today he had. Then the scream pierced through his thoughts, cutting through the tension like a knife. "My baby! Where's my baby?" Malik froze. The officer stopped, his hand still gripping Malik's wrist, but his attention now diverted to the source of the commotion. A woman came rushing out of a nearby store, her face pale with panic. Her blonde hair flew behind her as she ran toward the stroller. Malik's eyes widened as she came closer, her frantic steps quickening when she saw the baby. "Oh my God! That's her! That's my daughter!" The officer's grip on Malik loosened for a split second as the woman approached the stroller. She was shaking, her breath erratic, as she carefully lifted the baby from the stroller. The baby, still crying, stopped for a brief moment as the woman held her close, rocking her gently. Her eyes were wide with shock and relief. Malik stayed silent, standing there, still in the officer's loose grasp. His stomach twisted as he watched the woman clutch her child. He had helped. He had tried to save her. But now, it seemed like he was just a part of the puzzle, an unwelcome piece that had somehow led to a moment of truth. "Who found her? Who saved her?" the woman asked, looking around frantically. Her gaze locked onto Malik. For the first time, he saw something different in her eyes, something more than fear or confusion. It was gratitude, and something he couldn't quite place. Did you help her?" the woman asked again, her voice shaking. Malik swallowed hard, still not sure how to respond. He had helped, but he didn't feel like he deserved any recognition. Not for this. Not for doing something that anyone should have done. His chest ached with a sudden rush of emotion. Frustration, relief, and a strange sense of guilt. He had done the right thing. But did anyone believe him? He nodded. "I found her. I didn't leave her," he whispered, his voice barely audible, drowned out by the noise of the gathering crowd. The woman's face softened, but the officer remained silent, staring at Malik. It was clear to him that the baby's mother didn't see Malik as a threat. She saw him as her savior. Her expression shifted from panic to gratitude, and that's when it hit Malik the hardest. He had done something good. He had made a choice that would change this woman's life, and maybe his own. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't invisible. The officer's expression flickered. For the first time, Malik noticed the uncertainty in his eyes. Officer Daniels was stuck. His initial assumption, his belief that Malik was the criminal, had just been shattered in the blink of an eye. The real criminal wasn't the boy standing in front of him, shaking and scared. It was the person who had left this child to fend for herself. The officer knew it. He felt it. "Wait, you know this baby?" the officer finally asked, his voice less accusatory than before. The woman nodded, still holding the baby close to her chest. "Yes, she's my daughter. She was taken from me, stolen. I don't even know how she ended up here." Malik watched the officer carefully, the weight of the moment settling over him. This wasn't the story he had expected. For once, the truth had broken through the thick walls of assumption. He had saved the baby, but it wasn't just about saving a life. It was about proving to the world that his worth wasn't defined by where he came from or what people thought of him. "Thank you," the woman whispered, looking at Malik as she gently rocked her daughter in her arms. "Thank you for saving her. I don't know what I would have done without you." Malik's throat tightened, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. There were no words that could explain the emotions swirling inside him, the confusion, the frustration, the sense of justice that for once felt real. The officer stepped back, eyes still on Malik, as if trying to piece together the situation. Malik knew he wasn't out of the woods yet, but for the first time, he didn't feel like just another mistake in the eyes of the law. For the first time, he felt like a person, and that more than anything made him believe that maybe, just maybe, he had finally been seen. Have you ever been wrongly accused? How did it make you feel? Let us know. The tension in the air was thick as the woman held her daughter close, her eyes never leaving Officer Daniels. Malik stood there, a silent witness to the unfolding drama, still trying to process everything that had just happened. "You thought he took her?" The woman's voice was sharp, tinged with disbelief. She glared at Officer Daniels, her words cutting through the silence. "You accused him. You scared him. And he was the only one who did the right thing. Malik flinched slightly at the intensity of her gaze. He could feel the weight of her words, but he was still too rattled to speak. His hands trembled at his sides, the adrenaline from the past few minutes still coursing through his veins. He didn't understand why the officer had reacted the way he did, but he could feel the injustice of it all. Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between the woman and Malik. He cleared his throat, adjusting his stance, as if to regain control of the situation. It looked suspicious, he muttered, his voice lacking conviction. His eyes darted around, as if searching for any justification for his actions. The woman stepped forward, her voice cold, hard as steel. So you saw a black boy with a white baby, and you just assumed he was a threat. Malik's heart skipped a beat. He had never been so aware of his own skin as he was in that moment. The judgment in the officer's eyes had been clear, even before the accusations had flown. He had seen it all his life, this suspicion that followed him because of the color of his skin, because of his circumstances. But he had never been so aware of it as he was now. The officer looked down, unable to meet the woman's gaze. The words hung in the air between them like a heavy fog, the truth now undeniable. "You didn't even give him a chance," the woman continued, her voice rising in anger. "You accused him without any evidence, without knowing who he was, without asking a single question. And you scared him. You scared a child." Malik's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. He had always been taught to stay quiet when adults argued, to avoid confrontation, to let things blow over. But this time was different. He had done nothing wrong. He had only tried to help. The officer took a step back, his hand hovering near his belt, but he didn't say anything more. His silence spoke volumes. The woman, still holding her daughter, turned back to Malik. Her eyes softened, and she stepped closer to him, her voice gentle now. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you for saving my daughter. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there." Malik nodded, still too shaken to speak. The gratitude in her eyes was almost too much to bear, and he found himself blinking back tears that threatened to spill over. No one had ever looked at him like that, like he was something worth saving. As the officer stood there, silently observing, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Malik realized that no matter how many times he tried to prove his worth, no matter how many good deeds he did, there would always be people who saw him as less than. But today, he had been seen, not as a criminal, not as someone to be feared, but as a person. And that was enough. The officer, still avoiding the woman's gaze, spoke in a low voice. "We'll need to file a report," he muttered, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. The woman turned on him one last time, her voice calm but firm. "Number, you will not file anything. This child did nothing wrong. You'll leave him alone." Malik's heart pounded in his chest. For the first time in his life, someone had stood up for him. And not just anyone, someone who had every right to be angry, to be scared. But instead, she had used her voice to protect him. The officer hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. He glanced at Malik one last time, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said, though his words felt hollow. A boy who wasn't invisible. A boy who had a story worth telling. "Have you ever been wrongly accused? How did it make you feel? Let us know." The woman knelt in front of Malik, her eyes soft with emotion. She gently cupped his small hands, still trembling from the adrenaline of the moment. "You saved my daughter's life," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. I can never thank you enough." Malik looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always been told that he didn't belong, that people like him were invisible, just another face in the crowd. But today, in the chaos, in the fear, he had been seen. Not just as a street kid, but as someone who mattered. Her hand reached into her purse, pulling out a thick roll of cash. She pressed it into his small hands, her fingers warm, her face filled with the sincerity that Malik had never felt from anyone before. "I don't want money," Malik said, his voice firm despite the shaking in his chest. "I just want a family." The words hung in the air for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. His throat tightened, and for the first time he felt something deep inside him stir, a hope. He had never dared to wish for anything more than survival. But today, with this simple statement, he had expressed a need he had kept hidden for so long. The woman's eyes softened even more, and a tear escaped down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, her gaze locking onto Malik. "For the first time, I really see you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I promise you're not invisible." With that, she stood up, reaching for his hand gently, pulling him toward her. Her voice, though gentle, carried the weight of something far greater than words could express. "Come with me, Malik." A warmth spread through him, a warmth he hadn't known in a long time. As they walked away from the scene, Malik turned his head back to see Officer Daniels standing by his patrol car. The officer didn't say a word, just watched them as they left. Officer Daniels had already made up his mind about Malik. He had seen a kid who didn't belong, someone to be feared, someone to be suspicious of. But in the end, the truth had spoken louder than the officer's preconceived notions. Malik had saved a life, and nothing could take that away from him. The woman, who had once seen Malik as just another kid in the crowd, now saw him for who he was. Not a criminal, not a threat, but a boy who had done the right thing, no matter the consequences. As they reached the car, the woman smiled down at him. "Let's go home." The words were simple, but they carried a weight Malik had never felt before. Home. A place he had never known, but now, for the first time, it felt possible. A place where he wasn't invisible. A place where he could be someone worth loving, someone worth caring for. And as they drove off, Malik's heart swelled with hope. He had made the right choice. He had done the right thing. He had saved a life. And no one could take that away from him. In that moment, Malik knew that the world could try to judge him, label him, and cast him aside. But he was stronger than they thought. The truth had been his weapon, and in the end, it was the one thing that would never fail him. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Drop a comment below.